Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me here again. This is my first time to speak in an audience like this in full 2 years. I have done all of these events through the online, but apparently these people found that I happen to be in Taiwan, and there was quite a bit of pressure that I appear in person. So I haven't told my company yet that I'm appearing in person. The last 2 years have been a very difficult period for a lot of people, and economists are no exception. Just going through what happened last year, I sometimes wish that I'm an epidemiologist or political scientist, military experts, to be able to predict what has been happening, because so many shocks are happening from outside the economies, but that are having huge impact on economic development. And of course, most of you are aware of what happened in Ukraine after February of this year. This is changing the whole setup of the economies and the countries around the world. This is not just a problem between Ukraine and Russia. It's changing everything, including what's happening in Asia. And I'm sure you have noticed that so many people in the United States and Japan are now talking about Taiwan. Why all of a sudden? Because of what's happening in Ukraine. So I think it's important to understand the full implications of what's happening in Ukraine, because it is going to affect all of us in Asia, both in economically as well as in the political situation. So if I may use this chart, I'm sure you have already understood a lot about what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. But there's one point that I think has not been well appreciated. Can I have a cup? And that is that there is quite a bit of support for Mr. Putin in Russia, even now. And where is that support coming from? Because unless you understand this fact, you cannot really predict what's going to happen in the future. And this chart shows what's happening to what happened to Russian per capita GDP in US dollar terms, and what happened to Ukrainian per capita GDP. And if you look at this chart, you'll notice that during the Soviet days, per capita GDP of Russians was 3,777, right here. It's not very high, it's actually quite low, but it was up there. Then during the 10 years from communist centrally planned economy to the capitalist economy, that 10 years under President Yeltsin, you notice that the Russian GDP, per capita GDP, actually fell to 1/3. So instead of having a more prosperous life under a more democratic system, the per capita GDP of Russian people collapsed to just 1/3, 1,300. This is one of the lowest of any country. And I was in Russia at that time, and it was absolutely horrible. The whole country was collapsing. The economy was collapsing. Inflation rate 6,000 times. All the Russian savings were lost during that period. So instead of getting into Western democracies and market economy, enjoying free and prosperous life, Russian lives were completely destroyed during those 10 years. And so their hope to become another Western nation was completely shattered. And that happened because they basically used a wrong policy. They should have learned from Deng Xiaoping in China to do these things slowly, not so quickly. But they did very quickly, and the result was this horrendous mess. Then when Mr. Putin came along, he reversed everything, used some very heavy-handed Russian ways, and look what happened to Russian per capita GDP. It increased by 12 times in 14 years. Now, just imagine that. If your living standards improve 12 times in 14 years, you would think Putin is God, right? It's a national savior. I mean, he used very tough measures that ordinary Western countries won't be able to use, but the result was obviously there. And that is the support that Putin enjoys from the Russian people. And then, as you can see here, per capita GDP does fall. And the fall of the GDP came because Russia took over the Crimean Peninsula, and then the Western nations all applied economic sanctions. But Putin could still claim to the Russian people that, yes, we suffered economically a little bit, but we got our Crimea back. And apparently Russian people said, well, yeah, we suffered a little bit, but we got this very important territory back. So that apparently went okay with them. So this is Putin that we are dealing with. And there's one other example like this in history, and that is when Adolf Hitler came to Germany. When Hitler took over Germany in 1933, German unemployment rate was 28%. People were literally starving to death. It was an absolutely horrible situation. Just 5 years later, German unemployment rate was just 2%. And everybody said, my gosh, from 28 to 2% in 5 years. And US unemployment rate in 1938, that 5 years, was still 19%. So US was still suffering from 19% unemployment, Great Depression, German unemployment rate down to 2%. Very prosperous, very well-run economy. That's why those Germans end up supporting Hitler. Of course, that resulted in a complete disaster for all of them. But this is what's happening in Russia, that Putin managed to, improve the economy to the point where many Russians could feel that they are proud and their country is revived all over again. And if you look at Ukraine, on the other hand, it's going nowhere. And just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine was considered one of the worst, the most corrupt nation in the world. Not just in Europe, but in the world. And the economy was doing very poorly all along. A lot of good Ukrainians were leaving leaving Ukraine to find jobs in Western Europe. So Putin probably thought, wow, Ukraine is in such a mess. We are doing quite well. If we go in, I'm sure Ukrainians would welcome us. That's what he really thought. But then the situation turned very differently. Once the war started, Ukrainians started fighting. And that was totally outside the expectation of Mr. Putin. So if we put these things together, what can we say about the three parties that are involved? The Ukrainians, the West, and the Russians. For the Russians, Putin is still enjoying quite a bit of support as a kind of a national savior from the very bad state 1999 all the way to the present. So he cannot back down very easily because he has plenty of support. And how about the West? Now the West, I don't know how many of you have actually gone through Western educational system. I myself is a product of San Francisco public school system. So I went to junior high school, and college in San Francisco. Americans take history classes very seriously. Even though United States only have this very short history, they take that history very seriously. In every class, when they get to 1938, they have a big discussion. What happened in 1938? Well, in 1938, Adolf Hitler of Germany and Neville Chamberlain of UK had a meeting. And Hitler was, with a very strong economy, very strong army, was saying, we want to get these territories we lost during World War I back, because in those territories, Germans are still living there. And the UK, France, other Western nations, their economies were in very sad shape. And so they wanted to have a peace with Germany. So they agreed to give certain parts of Czechoslovakia to Germany on the condition that that will be the last territory Hitler will ever demand. And Hitler promised that. So Neville Chamberlain said, okay, let's have a peace agreement. So that was the 1938 peace deal. Well, just 1 year later, Hitler attacked Poland and the World War II began. So that experience taught the Western democracies that you never appease a dictator. You never make peace with a dictator. You have to fight them from the very first step onwards. If you give them an inch, they want 2 inches. And then you get worse and worse and worse until you really have to fight at the end. But by then, you have given them so much more time and resources to fight you. So from the very beginning, you have to stop them. That's what is behind this very strong resistance among Americans, among Western Europeans, against what Mr. Putin is doing. And I'm sure you have heard, watched CNN and those places. All these Western leaders are saying, we are not going to let Putin win. We are not going to let Putin win. It's because of this idea, 1938, a Munich peace agreement. So Westerns are in that mode. And finally, how about the Ukrainians? Well, a lot of people thought Ukrainians might give up very quickly, but turned out that they are very strong fighters, determined fighters. And because of all the Western help, Ukrainians are in no hurry to make a peace agreement with Russia. So if you put these 3 things together, you get certain conclusions, right? We're not going to get peace very soon, because all of them have reasons to continue fighting. And furthermore, the West thinks that they can actually win at the end. Why do they think they can win at the end? Because the Russian economy is only 7% of the US economy, only 10% of the EU economy. Russian economy is just about the size of South Korea. So if you draw the Russians into Ukraine and then beat them up, pretty soon their war machine will be depleted. And once they are weakened, because they don't have any more tanks left, they don't have any more missiles left, they won't be able to do this thing that they did to Ukraine to other countries, like Moldova, to Baltic states, to Finland, Sweden, because their tanks are all gone. So from the Western side, they think they can win this war eventually if Ukrainians are willing to fight, because Russian economy cannot keep up with the losses that they are sustaining. So that's basically the Western thinking, that as long as Ukrainians are willing to fight, let's support them so that Russian military will be depleted. And once it's depleted, you won't be able to do the kind of thing they did to Ukraine to other neighbors. So that means the war will go on until something happens in Russia itself. But what is even more important is the second point. And the second point is that for the first time in 30 years, economic issues are giving a lower priority than political issues. If you remember the world before the Cold War, so before 1990, if you look at the United States government, it was the White House and all these ministries, departments. Which one came right after the White House? State Department. Which one came after the State Department? Defense Department, Pentagon. And then after that, Treasury, USDR, Federal Reserve, blah, 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 onwards. But those were kind of a second tier. First tier, the best and the brightest, were always in the State Department and the Defense Department, because they are the ones who are keeping the world peace, the global order. But once the Cold War is over, Soviet Union collapsed, then we didn't have to spend all that money on defense and all that kind of thing. And then economic issues, for example, Treasury became a lot more important. Federal Reserve became a lot more important. State Department and Defense Department kind of faded in the background. And so as long as this makes economic sense, you can invest in anywhere, whether the other country may be communist, other country may be dictatorship. As long as you can make money, everything was fine. And that's the world we lived until February of this year. But after the Russian invasion, the whole thing is changed. Now, defending democracy, defending open society, defending liberal order, they are the most important thing for Western countries now. And you can see this from, we just heard about the energy prices in Germany. Why is energy prices in Germany so high? Because they were dependent on Russian energy. For 40% of their energy was from Russia. But the German people was willing to say, okay, we're not going to buy any more from Russia. Even though it's going to be very expensive going forward, we are going to endure this economic pain to make sure that our liberal order, democratic order, will be maintained. I couldn't believe that Germans actually did that. And it's not just the Germans. Italians and others also going through the same massive increase in energy prices because they refused to buy from Russia. And what that means is that economic priorities are now far below the political priorities to make sure that liberal democratic order is maintained, even if they suffer horrendously on economic front. What does that mean for this part of the world? What that means is that if you are dealing with a non-democratic nation, and if that nation happens to be supporting Russia, you might be looked with suspicion from all the Western economies by saying, hey, this Taiwanese company is actually dealing with these guys, and these guys are actually supporting Russia. Shall we deal with this Taiwanese company? It's that kind of thing that may be affecting this part of the world soon. And unfortunately, Chinese are quite close to the Russians. And that means any company that has dealing with China will be viewed, especially if the Chinese side is dealing with the Russians, with quite a bit of suspicion, quite a bit of scrutiny going forward. I'm not saying that they will be immediately punished and things like that, but you will be running a risk of losing access to American market, the Japanese market, or the Western market if it turns out that you are indirectly or sometimes even directly supporting what the Russians are doing through this Chinese angle. So in that sense, the world has changed so much on that one day in February this year. After the Russian invasion, this whole global order is turned almost upside down. And so I think all of you should be very careful about these geopolitical issues, which we didn't have to think about for the last 30 years. It's now a very big issue today. And as I said earlier, this Taiwan is viewed with very much great concern among people in Washington, people in Japan. Before, let's say, the last year or two, maybe you see Taiwan news in the Japanese newspapers once every a week or so, once every 2 weeks. Now the Taiwan news is on almost every day in one of these major Japanese newspapers to make Japanese people aware that what could happen here could affect all of Asia, including Japan. And I was in Washington 6 months ago to talk with people who are involved in these issues. And wow, everybody's talking about Taiwan and wondering whether Taiwan has a willingness to fight against these unfriendly forces. And then I arrived in Taiwan a few weeks ago, and I noticed that, wow, everybody's having a great life as before. So I'm a little bit worried about this part of the problem, in that, as Mr. Xi Jinping just said earlier, if Taiwan is not showing its willingness to defend its values, defend the sovereignty, then the Americans and others may start getting worried. So it's not just an economic issue anymore. It's a very large political issue, and it can have a huge influence in this part of the world going forward. So that's the geopolitics talk, the geopolitics part of my talk. Now let me move to the economics part, some part we are much more familiar with. Now, on the economics front, we talk inflation a lot, but a large part of the inflation comes from basically two forces. One is the energy, and the other one is supply side problems. And the energy part is recently often confused, combined with this Russian invasion of Ukraine. But in fact, energy prices start rising long before the Ukrainian incident, starting with the second half of last year. And why did the energy prices suddenly start increasing so rapidly? Not just oil, but coal and gas, all of those suddenly increasing so rapidly. It's because we now have a completely different agenda for the entire humanity, and that is climate change. So while so many of us are occupied with COVID-19, this climate change thing that came up and became so important in the last 2 years or so is now dictating so many economic issues around the world. And climate change, I mean, to not to use fossil fuel and move to renewable energy is going to be a massive challenge for the humanity, because the last 400 years, ever since the Industrial Revolution, all these economies were built on fossil fuel energy source. And to move away from that into renewables, possibly nuclear, but this is going to take a very long time. It's a fundamental change. And that's why we are seeing this massive increase in energy prices. And why do we get this increase in energy prices? Because we are shifting away. It's quite simple. If you're an energy producer, if you are exploring for oil, gas, or coal, in the past, you could always be sure that the demand for your product is going to increase with economic development. So even if you did lousy investments, at the end of the day, demand was always there so that you can sell your products and then you can come out in a better shape. Now, the situation is completely different. So many countries are passing laws saying you cannot sell diesel cars, you cannot sell gasoline cars after 2030 or 2030 or 2035. What that means is that the demand for your product may start falling quite rapidly after 2030, 2035. Europeans, the Chinese, they're all passing those laws to stop people from selling diesel cars or gasoline cars. If you know that your product, the demand for your product will be falling in 8 years from now, what do you have to do? You have to make all your profits, you have to recover all your cost of investments and make a good profit within that 8 year period. And not only that, this 8 years is becoming shorter every day. Next year will be only 7 years. Next year will be only 6 years. So instead of investing in, let's say you have 100 projects, maybe you invest 80 of them. Now you invest in maybe only 50. Next year you may invest only 40, because only those 40, you're absolutely sure that you're going to make money in that limited time horizon. So the supply of fossil fuel will not be increasing rapidly. It could be actually falling going forward. But the demand is still there as economies are recovering from COVID-19. So with the increased demand, reduced supply, you end up with these the high energy prices that we see. Now, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine did push them a little higher, so we might come back to some extent, but it will be still at very high levels, even if the Russian-Ukraine conflict is resolved. Because this energy thing is a very fundamental to all the economies around the world. And this is a fundamental change since the Industrial Revolution, which happened in 1700s. And furthermore, because of this energy issue, the renewable energy issue, many countries are now considering, especially in Western Europe, that if the country that you outsourced is not doing enough on climate change, then we should put some tariffs or other restrictions on the imports from that country. And that makes sense from your perspective, right? If you're putting all these restrictions, but then everybody decides to produce in Southeast Asia or somewhere else and then bring the products back, Earth as a whole, the planet as a whole, is still warming. And so in order to stop that, they're talking about these restrictions, and some of them could be in place fairly soon. So that would be actually bad for globalization. But what is bad for globalization means it's inflationary as well. So, and then furthermore, lots of things that are now running on gas, coal, or oil right now, boilers, other equipment, they will have to be replaced with those running on electricity. That also means lot more domestic investments, and that could also be inflationary as well. And lastly, this is going to take a long time. It's not going to be done in 1 or 2 years. It's going to take 5, 10, 20, 30 years for this transformation to be completed. So this pressure will be with us for a very long time to come. So that's the inflationary part. That's the energy part of the inflation. And I'm afraid this is going to be with us for a long time to come. And then the macro part of the inflation issue is what's happening to the inventories around the world. During the pandemic, a lot of retailers decided to allow the inventories to drop because they never knew when the customers would be coming back. So they allow this is the case of the United States, they allow the inventories to drop, but then all these customers are coming back as economy began to improve. So they have a long way to rebuild their inventories. But to rebuild their inventories, you have to order more than your current demand. So if the demand is here, you have to order more than demand to make sure that you have more goods to rebuild your inventories. But as so many retailers did the same thing at the same time, the demand became huge, and that caused all sorts of logistic problems. Now, when you are the retailer, and you said, if you order 100 products now, maybe only 50 will arrive in time. Then what do? You order 200, right? If you order 200, then you will get 100 at the end. So because of these logistic problems, they kept on ordering more and more and more, just to make sure that you get the needed amounts at the end of the day. But for the manufacturers getting all these orders, whether in Taiwan or in China or Japan, suddenly the order books are growing very, very rapidly. So you need to hire more workers, you have to get more materials. That adds to inflationary pressure going forward. So those are the factors that added to this inflation issues. And so I think we can separate the inflation into 3 drivers. One is the energy I just already described to you, that because of this massive transformation from renewables, from fossil fuel to renewables, energy prices will remain quite high for a long time to come. And on the demand side, because of the economic recovery, People are ordering to make sure that they have enough inventory. But because of the logistics problems, they kept on ordering more. And that adds to the demand, and that was adding to inflation. And on the supply side, we have a very strange disease, this COVID-19. If you look back the last 2 years, you notice that this COVID-19 has hit the countries in very uneven ways. For example, last year, Taiwan did a beautiful job. Very few infections. This year, not such a great job. China, same thing. Last year, they were kind of okay. This year, they had to do massive lockdowns. But Europe and the United States were the opposite. Last year, they were in a horrendous mess. This year, they're doing quite well. So this very uneven. One country is doing well, the other countries next to it is doing poorly. If all the countries had their infections go increase and decrease at the same time, I think it would have been much easier to handle. But with so many uneven developments all around the world, your supply chain is completely screwed up, right? Because now you outsourced all these things from around the world, but all of these parts have to be in one place so that you can actually make this product and you can ship it out. If one piece is missing, this thing sits in your factory until the one piece actually arrives. So as a result of this very uneven COVID-19 situation, we have supply way below the usual level, whereas demand is way above the usual level. So two together, of course, and then plus the energy, you get inflation. So that's the very high inflation rates we are seeing at the moment. My own feeling is that this part of inflation will become less and less important going forward. And I'm sure some of you have already noticed these news reports that this big American retailer called Target now got too much inventories because all the ones that they ordered in the past actually start arriving. Now you have these 200 pieces where you only need 100 at most. So these things always catch up with a lag. Now there's enough time for the pieces they ordered in the past to actually arrive in your warehouses. So the inventory problem is becoming a huge problem in the opposite direction. So my guess is that this problem will probably abate as we move forward. And inflationary pressure from that side will be reduced maybe 6 months from now, 1 year from now. But the other two, the energy part and the supply part, well, energy part, we know it's not going to go away. Supply part, we just hope that there's no new variant coming along. Because another variant comes and then, we're all going back to square one. But that's the inflation picture we see today. Then we have to ask the question, well, what happened to all the factors that brought us deflation in the previous 10 years? What happened to them? Are they still with us? Or they are completely gone? And the reason we had this deflation, there are, I think, 3 reasons as well. First is what I have always talked about, this what I call balance sheet recession. That during the bubble days, everybody leveraged themselves up. Once the bubble burst, asset prices collapsed, liabilities remain, and they realize that they have a balance sheet problems. If you have a balance sheet problems, if you're technically bankrupt, you have to come out of this by paying down debt as quickly as possible. And if you're paying down debt, you're not borrowing money, you're not investing, and the economy starts weakening if people start paying down debt. For economy to grow, if someone is saving money, someone else has to borrow money. But if everybody's repairing balance sheets, they're all paying down debt, not borrowing money, then the economy gets weaker and weaker and weaker. So that problem is still with us, unfortunately. And the other problem is that suppose the demand for your product increases suddenly. Do you want to expand your factory in Taiwan? Or do you want to increase your factory that you have in Vietnam? And too often, people just end up increasing the factory in Vietnam instead of the one at home because the wages are so much lower over there than here. I'm sure some companies are investing in Taiwan as well, and we had heard that just a while ago. But I'm sure many Taiwanese companies are also expanding factories in Philippines, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and other places. But if they expand the factories there and not at home, those companies at home will not be borrowing money. But if someone is saving and no one is borrowing, the economy weakens as well. So two together, we end up in a situation where there are a lot of savings, but not enough borrowers. When you are in that situation, the correct solution is for the government to borrow money. If the government borrows money and make renewable energy generators and other things, that would be great. But so many governments around the world, including one here in Taiwan, are faced with all these silly regulations limiting how much government can borrow. And so even though government has to borrow in the circumstances like this, they cannot borrow as much as they really need to. And the monetary policy, central bank increasing and lowering interest rates, that only works when there are borrowers. If there are no borrowers, you raise interest rates, you lower interest rates, nothing happens. And of course, nothing happened in the last 15 years or so. So these problems are the ones that brought us the deflation for the last 15 years. And the supply side too, there are still many countries like Bangladesh who wants to enter the global supply chain so that their economies will grow. So they saw Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, China, all these countries entering global supply chain and growing rapidly. There are many other countries who still want to join that, including Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, all these other countries. And they will continue to supply products at the lowest cost, lower cost. So that adds to deflation or disinflation. How big are these problems today? Well, this is the Japanese corporate behavior. This chart shows that above zero, if the blue bars goes further up, that means they're increasing savings. If the orange bars go below zero, that means they're increasing borrowings. And the line with small circles, that's the net number. And the fact that they are below zero means corporate sector has been borrowing money. So household sector saving money, corporate sector borrowing money, economy was doing very well. But once the bubble burst in Japan in 1989, look what happened. Suddenly, the corporate sector stopped borrowing money. And for like 15 years, orange bars above zero. So they are paying down debt to repair their balance sheets. And more recently, they start borrowing money. So I would say Japanese balance sheet recession is behind us. But the corporate number, the net number is still above zero. Why is it still above zero when their balance sheets are already repaired? Well, it's still above zero because many Japanese companies realize that it's still cheaper to produce in Indonesia, Philippines, and other places than in Japan. So they're investing over there. They're not investing at home. So as a result, they're still above zero. So it means not only household sector is a net saver, corporate sector is also a net saver in Japan. And no wonder Japanese inflation rates are so low, because both private sectors are actually saving money, not borrowing money, even at zero interest rates. Then you look at other countries. This is the United States. This is a quarterly number. And here, this is the household sector. Why do I have a household sector? Because the US bubble was in housing. And if you look at this, during the bubble days, US households were actually net borrowers. You expect household sector to be saving money, corporate sector to be borrowing money. But during the bubble days, US household sector was actually borrowing. And then once the bubble burst, suddenly all the borrowings disappeared, and US household sector started saving massively. Now, more recently, some borrowings came back, but still on a net basis, US household sector is a huge net saver, 10% of GDP. So, and this is happening at zero interest rates, 10% of GDP. This is first quarter of this year. First quarter of this year, US interest rates are still zero. So at zero interest rates, they were saving 10% of GDP means that US households are still not very comfortable with their balance sheets. If they were, they should be borrowing 10% of GDP, not saving 10% of GDP at zero interest rates. And then you look, this is the US corporate sector. And US corporate sector, you see the same pattern. During the 1970s and 80s, they were borrowing money, so household sector saving money, corporate sector borrowing money. But more recently, the last 20 to 30 years, US corporate sector was not a borrower either, because they were investing in Mexico, they were investing in Southeast Asia, but not at home. So the US corporate sector is also a net saver. So US household sector saving money, US corporate sector saving money. No wonder interest rates were so low in all of these economies. And if you look at Europe, you see the same story. This is Spain. Spain had a huge housing bubble, and during the bubble days, they borrowed lots of money. After that, they stopped borrowing altogether, actually paid down debt for like 10 years. And now they're beginning to borrow, but the net number is still way above zero, which means Spain is not fully out of this balance sheet recession either. This is Ireland. It's even worse. Ireland had the biggest housing bubble in Europe, and they are still saving money like crazy. So what that means is that all the factors that brought deflation to us, to a large extent, are still with us. And if you look at this number, I'm sure many of you remember this chart from the previous presentations. Here, this orange area in the middle is how much private sector as a group in these economies have saved or borrowed from the Lehman shock, 2008, to the most recent period. So in the case of the United States, you see the number 7.31. 7.31 means if you add household sector, corporate sector, and financial sector taken together, they were saving on average 7.3% of GDP per year since 2008 to the most recent period. And the number for Japan here, number is 8.15, for Europe, 5.05. And if you look at the most recent numbers, these ones here, they are 8.72 for the US, 9.17 for Japan, and 7.7% for Europe. So these people are still saving money, still saving massive amounts of money at zero or negative interest rates. So what this means is that if the other two factors that produced inflation, the supply side problems and demand side problems, work themselves out, we could possibly go back to where we were 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So except the energy sector, which will remain inflationary for a long time to come, the other sectors could go back to where we were before. Except in one area, and that is that in the United States, we are seeing something quite different very recently. This chart shows monetary base, money supply, and credit growth. And I'm sure many of you remember this chart. These three lines are supposed to move together, as we learn in universities, right? If the Federal Reserve increases monetary base by 10%, money supply, credit increasing by 10%. That's what we all learn in universities. And that did exist until the Lehman shock, 2008. Then once the Lehman crisis happened, Federal Reserve under Chairman Ben Bernanke did the QE1, QE2, QE3, increased monetary base something like 400%, trying to get the economy to move. But the economy failed to respond, especially in terms of credit. Money supply grew only very slowly, and the credit actually shrunk. And the credit actually shrunk at first here because people were paying down debt, as you saw earlier. And then after that, credit only grew very, very slowly. And I would argue that it's this line that we have to watch very carefully going forward, because the central bank can add all the reserves it wants by just buying assets from the private sector. But for that money to come out of the commercial banks and enters the real economy, banks have to lend this money. The banks cannot give away money because that money belongs to depositors. And this green line shows how much money actually came out of the banking system. And the fact that the money only came out just before the pandemic, this number is 145. That means only 45% increase in money coming out of the banking system and entering the real economy over 12 years, which is nothing. It's only like 4% increase per year. That's not going to be enough to really have inflation, which is why the US inflation numbers remain so low. But when you look at the most recent period, something else is happening. So this is that part enlarged. When the pandemic hit, there was a huge jump in borrowings because everybody thought they have to have some money in a bank to be able to make payments during the lockdowns. And that happened in other economies too. But once they realized that it's not so bad after all, they returned the money back to the banks. So the bank lending actually fell. But if you look at the most recent period, it is increasing quite rapidly. At the annual rate of more than 11% per year. We haven't seen anything like this in a long time. And this suggests that some borrowers in the United States might be coming back. But if they are coming back, we are in trouble. Why? Because of all the quantitative easing the central bank did over all these years. Well, let me just skip these, but this is actually a US problem because in Europe, this is Europe, things are still quite stable. This is UK, quite stable. Japan, not much change. So the sudden increase in borrowing is really the US problem. But because it is increasing rapidly, if you are Jay Powell at the Federal Reserve, you become very concerned because up to now, borrowings were not there. So you could argue that all the inflation is a supply-driven part that Federal Reserve shouldn't be involved in. But if the borrowings pick up like you saw earlier, then it's going to be demand-driven problem because all these people start borrowing money and spending money. And then you're going to have huge inflation in your hands. The fact that Jay Powell suddenly changed his policy November of last year. Before November of last year, remember, Federal Reserve was saying, oh, this is a transitory problem, nothing to worry about. We should be fighting deflation, not inflation. In November of last year, suddenly the Federal Reserve changed. And I think it's because they suddenly realized that the borrowings were picking up. Because if the borrowings were picking up, and you have so much excess reserves in the banking system, here, I'm sorry. This is the excess reserves in the banking system. It's up to here. And if these are all lent out, you can have massive inflation in your hands. So they have to bring this thing down. And you also have to tighten monetary policy from this very low level very quickly. And that's basically what we are seeing now. Chairman Powell shifting from deflation fighter to an inflation fighter. But this shift is going to be very, very difficult because there's so much excess reserves in the banking system, this thing. We have never experienced anything like this before, that there's so much excess reserves in the banking system, and the central bank suddenly have to tighten monetary policy. And furthermore, asset prices have been rising quite sharply. This is US commercial real estate and housing prices, and they are way above the previous peak. I mean, the previous peak was bad enough. Now, commercial real estate prices are almost 70% higher than the previous peak. House prices are almost 60% higher than the previous peak. So they have to do something about this issue as well. So not only inflation issues, but we have this asset bubble issue in the United States. So now they have to kill these problems as quickly as possible. So this chart shows how much excess reserves are in the banking system. And the amount involved is $3.6 trillion. Before the Lehman crisis, right here, excess reserves in the banking system was only 18 billion US dollars. Now the amount is 3.6 trillion US dollars. What that means is that there's 2,000 times more excess reserves in the banking system than just 14 years ago. 2,000 times. You try to tighten monetary policy to stop inflation when there's 2,000 times more excess reserves in the banking system. How are you going to do that? Well, of course, there's only two tools available. You raise interest rates as fast as possible, which is what's happening right now. 25 basis points increase, 50 basis points increase, now 75 basis points increase, another 75 basis points increase probably coming very quickly. They're doing that right now. And then they are trying to reduce this massive excess reserves. Now, they actually tried this once in 2017, so-called quantitative tightening. And that was this action here. The excess reserves kind of fell here by about $600 billion. At that time, there was no inflation, no borrowers are coming back. So reducing excess reserves at that time was not all that difficult. But this time, borrowers are coming back, inflation is rampant, and then you try to remove the excess reserves, it's going to be a very tough situation. So what Jay Powell did is to double the pace of quantitative tightening. So this is the last pace. This is the pace of quantitative tightening here in 2017. But this is too slow now, given that inflation is already such a big issue. So the quantitative tightening the Federal Reserve is implementing now is this one. They're trying to reduce the excess reserves at this speed. How big is this quantitative tightening? Well, this shows how much more supply of government bonds will be dumped into the bond market relative to federal government budget deficit. So this is the federal government budget deficit for this year. And according to the schedule they announced, this is the amount of additional bonds that will be in the market from the Federal Reserve quantitative tightening. And here, it doesn't look like such a large amount this year. That's only because this is all based on the fiscal year. And there's only 3 more months left for fiscal year 2020. So that's why the numbers look not so bad, 237 billion. But starting October of this year, we'll enter fiscal 2023, and the amount involved, according to the schedule that Federal Reserve announced, will be $1.14 trillion. That's actually bigger than US budget deficit for this year. So this quantitative easing is equivalent to doubling the US budget deficit as far as bond market is concerned. This is likely to push bond prices higher, bond yields higher, which we are already seeing. So suddenly, 10-year US Treasuries, 3.2%, actually went as high as 3.5%, because people realize that with the quantitative tightening schedule that the Federal Reserve announced, the demand and supply situation in the US bond market could become very, very tight. So this is what we are up against now. It's equivalent to federal government doubling the budget deficit in the environment of high inflation rates, private sector borrowers coming back, economy doing relatively well. This is a very difficult situation for the central bank in any country. And furthermore, because of this 3.6 trillion excess reserves in the banking system, financial condition in the United States is not tightening, even though the Federal Reserve is tightening the way I just described. This chart shows two lines. The red line is the Federal Reserve policy rate. And the other blue line is it's an index published by Chicago Federal Reserve called National Financial Condition Index. So this blue line goes up higher if it becomes very difficult to borrow money. And it comes down if it becomes easy to borrow money. Now remember, I'm sure you noticed that Jay Powell at the Fed often talks about Paul Volcker. That Paul Volcker was successful in killing the inflation, and therefore we are able to kill the inflation going forward. This is what happened during the Paul Volcker days. And I was already at the Federal Reserve at the time. When Paul Volcker, and at that time, the amount of reserves in the banking system was the constraint on the private sector credit growth. So when Paul Volcker tightened the credit supply, short-term interest rates went sky high, which is here, went as high as 22% at one point. At 22%, of course, real estate sector got killed, the economy got killed, and inflation, of course, died. That's how it happened here. Where are we now? We are down here still. And what is shocking is what happened during the previous round. At the previous round, Federal Reserve increased interest rates 9 times from 2015 to 2019. But nothing happened to the financial condition index. It stayed at extremely low level. So Federal Reserve is tightening monetary policy, but nothing is happening to the financial market. Why? Because there's so much excess reserves in the banking system. And so even the Federal Reserve is tightening, banks are stuck with so much excess reserves, they're trying to lend the money as quickly as they can. So what will that mean? These are the voices from the actual bankers that are introduced in what is known as a beige book. And I rely on this beige book a lot because you can hear the actual voices of what's happening to the American economy. And for example, if you look at the latest one, April 2022, the San Francisco Federal Reserve wrote that some banks have eased credit conditions, credit standards, to compete for loan customers. What does that mean? The bankers are actually easing their lending standards, even though the Federal Reserve is tightening monetary policy, because they still have so much money to lend. So how do you tighten monetary policy when bankers are flooded with cash? That's the challenge the Federal Reserve is faced with today. And the only way you can tighten monetary policy is to raise interest rates as fast as possible, do quantitative tightening as fast as possible, right? Because there's only 2 tools available. But to do that, of course, will have unfortunate implications on asset prices, as you would expect. So quantitative easing actually helped the economy through the positive wealth effect, so-called portfolio rebalancing effect. So the quantitative tightening will work also through the wealth effect, but in a negative way. So my guess is that Jay Powell will continue to tighten, even if that means lower and lower asset prices, because this is the only way to shock the economy to stop the inflation. Because the usual way doesn't work, as you saw earlier, because the bankers are still trying to lend. Very many of us in the market have grown used to this whole notion of central bank puts, or it used to be called Greenspan put, and then it was called Bernanke put, and then Janet Yellen put, in that if the central bank tightened monetary policy and the asset prices fall, central bank will always come in and help and stabilize the market. We got used to that for the last 20 years. This time around, I'm afraid that rule might not work, because under the circumstances, the only way monetary tightening can actually bite the economy and stop the inflation is through lower asset prices. And if you remember, Jay Powell just a few days ago said, I'm afraid it's going to be very difficult to achieve a soft landing. Remember that line just a few days ago? He thought earlier that we could get to the soft landing. But more recently, he's saying, no, it's not going to get to the soft landing that easily, because it's so much more difficult to tighten monetary policy with such a large excess reserves in the banking system. So this is the contrast between 2017 and this time around. Last time, when they were tightening, inflation environment was low. They were doing a preemptive tightening, and private sector was not borrowing money. Fed was doing everything it can to redirect the market's attention from quantitative tightening. So Janet Yellen often said, oh, please don't look at the QT. Our policy is all fully reflected in our interest rate policy. Please don't look at QT. Janet Yellen had to say that because if people pay attention to QT, the bond market could collapse. But at that time, bond market didn't collapse because no one was borrowing money to begin with. And they did very small QT compared to where we are now. And the QT was started 19 months after the first rate increase. Why did they wait 19 months? They had to wait 19 months to make sure that short-term interest rates are high enough so that when they do QT, and if the bond market collapses, they can immediately bring short-term rates to cushion the shock. That was the whole purpose. This time, they are doing the QT in 3 months from the beginning of the rate increase. Inflation is very high. Federal Reserve is obviously behind the curve. Private sector beginning to borrow money. And Jay Powell is actually telling the market that, yes, we are falling behind the curve, I'm sorry, but we are doing a lot of QT. So actually, he's directing market people to look at QT. But more they look at QT, more they get scared. So my guess is that this is closer to the hard landing scenario instead of what we had 3 years ago. And I wish I could deliver a much more positive outlook to you on these events. But I'm afraid this quantitative easing, which they did it so easily and without careful thoughts, are now coming to basically make us pay for it. And I'm afraid this is not just a US problem. As you saw in other charts, Japan, Europe, UK, they all did QE. And some of them massive amounts of QE. So they are all going to face this problem once they have to normalize monetary policy. And my fear is that the challenge that Japanese central bank face will be even bigger than most of the others because the amounts involved are just so large. As I said earlier, the factors that brought us deflation are still with us. And so some of these problems will eventually become less important once the supply and demands are more aligned. So except for the energy part, if the other side become more adjusted, then I think the worst part of the inflation problems will be behind us. But for the next few months, next few years, unfortunately, we still have to go through this process. And that means we could see quite a bit of volatility in the market and some nasty surprises here and there. I wish I can deliver something more positive than that, but I'm afraid that's what I see at the moment. Thank you so much for your attention.